Thank you for listening to Upaya's Dharma podcasts, an extraordinary series of talks from some of the finest Buddhist teachers in the world. I'm Joan Halifax, founder of Upaya Zen Center, and we're so happy to make these podcasts available to you. If you find this talk of benefit, please consider making a donation to support us to continue offering these recordings freely. You'll find a donation button on our podcast page. And thank you so much for listening.
This is Dharma Podcast at dharmapodcast.org. This is show number 874. It was recorded on September 4th, 2013, and it is titled Self and Selflessness. The speaker for this episode is Sean Murphy.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's always a pleasure to talk at Upaya. What I'd like to share with you tonight comes out of the work that I've been doing with teaching meditation students at University of New Mexico in Taos. And I've been doing that for 7 years. And actually, I haven't taught a creative writing class in a long time because the meditation classes have gotten so popular that I teach 3 meditation classes a semester now. So there's obviously a lot of hunger for this, these practices. And the other thing I've been doing is I run a nonprofit organization called the Sage Institute. And if you're ever interested, you could look up Sage Institute of Taos and Google, and you'll find it. We do secular meditation trainings. This is also grown out of the work I've done at the university, and it happens with the supervision of my teachers. But we're training people to give secular, simple meditation practice similar to what similar to what the average yoga teacher might do. So if you live in Des Moines, Iowa, and you would be uncomfortable walking into a Hindu center or a Zen center, you can still walk into your neighborhood gym and get a yoga class. And it won't seem weird to you necessarily. It won't look like Hinduism. But it's a little hard for people to find meditation that feels so free of any kind of trapping. So this is some of the work I've been doing. As part of this work, a couple things. When I get students in a meditation class at the university, I want to really cut to the chase quickly, because it might be, I have them for 16 weeks, that might be the only opportunity I have to help them with their lives. And I know very well that most of those people won't go on to practice, and many of them won't go on to continue a meditation practice. So I ask myself, what can I give them in 16 weeks that are some basic principles that come out of my Zen practice that can improve their lives? And so I really focus on that. The other thing is that I've really had to boil down the concepts so people can assimilate them easily. And it's interesting, I've recently been reading a book called Tracking Bodhidharma. I can't remember the writer's name. Andy Ferguson. And he's looking for the tracks of Bodhidharma through China, the first ancestor of Zen in China. And one of the things he's talking about is how non-metaphysical Zen was back in the beginning. It was very, very practical. There were different schools of Zen always, but Bodhidharma Zen, the Zen that is in the lineage we continue to practice today, very, very practical, very non-esoteric, very, very easily, directly graspable. That's where we get the verse about Zen being a direct pointing to the nature of mind beyond words and letters, very practical pointing to the nature of mind. So it's been an interesting study for me to try and do that with college students and try and do it in a secular setting. So we're talking about self and selflessness tonight, and it even still sounds to me like a big, well, it is, we could do weeks of seminars on it. We have only an evening to talk about it, but perhaps the most important area of inquiry in Buddhist practice is what's the nature of the self. Some people might say, well, isn't nature of suffering more important? I'd say, well, they're the same thing. The nature of suffering comes from our perception that we have a fundamentally separate self that we have to defend and that's constantly under threat. At least the kind of suffering that we can deal with through practice comes from that misconception. The strange thing is, it took me a lot of years of Zen practice to get to the point where I kind of understood what they were talking about. But I find that in an average semester, now we have a holistic health and healing arts program at UNM Taos, and a lot of the students come from that. A lot of them practice yoga or something else, so they're already a little seasoned, to receive this stuff. But I still find that about halfway through a semester, which is about 8 weeks, people are sitting well enough that we can start talking about things like the nature of the self in some kind of depth, and they get it. Or they get some part of it that can help their lives. So, especially if it's de-esoterized, if that's a word. If some of the apparent complexity of it is stripped down. For instance, well, what is a self? When you start looking into meditation and you start practicing meditation, our first practice is generally to try and keep the mind on the breath and to let go of thought constructs. Now we have a concept in Zen practice called original mind. And that can sound like a very distant, ungraspable concept that you have to sit for 20 or 30 years to understand. And it's true that it can be talked about in esoteric ways and in ways that do take deeper and deeper study, that can lead you deeper and deeper. But at the same time, I like to point to my students that we're visiting original mind every time we meditate. And that's because we were all born with an original mind. What did our original mind look like? Forget the esoterica of the koans that ask, what was your original mind before your parents were born, and et cetera. It's actually the same mind. But I like to dialogue with people. So I ask you, what was our original mind that we were born with? We all remember. If we cast our minds back, we can at least vaguely remember. For a while we had, what's the original mind that human beings come into the world with? What is it like?
Untethered.
Okay, untethered, yeah. Very practically, speaking very practically, what was that mind like? We all had that mind for a while. What was it like? It was open, yeah? It was open? Okay. What's that?
Free.
It was free, okay.
Joy.
Often joy. Generally, that original mind, which you see in children up to a certain age, if they have everything they need, and you see in animals, is a mind that tends to revert to interest and some degree of joy when it's not actively hurting, right? I mean, children they're not lying there going, why was I born with? They can't think that way yet, right? So children up to a certain point and animals tend to have the native condition that they revert to is one, at least of engagement and interest. And it's the upside of life, isn't it? When they're not actively hurting or crying or hungry or need to be changed. So somebody said something over here. Non-judgmental. Okay, why? Why is it non-judgmental? That's really interesting. Why is it non-judgmental?
Because nobody's told it what to think.
Right, okay. So judgment is learned. Okay, judgment's learned. All right. So, what? It's not separated, right. We didn't know when we were born what it was to be a separate being. That's really important. Judgment, actually, is one of the ways we learn the judgmental mind as it gets activated and as it begins to make judgments, begins to separate itself. Okay? So it's known scientifically that, to some degree at least, when infants are born, they don't really understand that they're a separate self from the world, from their mother. That's a learned thing. So, okay, we learn judgment. What else do we learn? Well, we have curiosity. And yeah, the natural state of that mind is curiosity, definitely. Yeah. Okay. We learn to mirror things. Okay. Yeah. I like the curiosity because we take an interest. That original mind takes an interest. Okay. So we've got a mind without judgment that isn't concerned with separation, that is taking an interest in anything. Does that sound anything like the mind we start to touch in meditation? That's what we're aiming for sure. That's what we're aiming for.
I don't think we want to revert to pre-rational, really, do we?
In one way to talk about meditation practice, not everything you do after meditation, or not all the ways that we talk about what Zen practice is, but when we're actually meditating, it's pre-rational. Yes, it is. It's pre-rational. Rational mind is a thinking mind, and that's our concern the rest of our lives. It's not a concern when we're in sitting meditation. Now, there are sometimes we're working on a concept or a koan, or we're struggling with something, But even that's meant to lead us into the empty mind, the mind that's pre-judgment.
Well, really, we think that the consciousness of an enlightened being is the same thing as a baby born?
No, of course not. No, certainly not. We have to go through a whole process of learning to be a separate self and then regain that. That's what the process is like. So oftentimes people who are very deeply practiced will have a sense of childlike curiosity, but that doesn't mean that they've lost their judgmental mind or their ability to plan or do all the other things that we do as humans. That's what the whole path looks like, is we return to a beginner's mind, a mind that can be open. A mind that can be open and not bound. We don't throw away our learning, but there's a difference between holding our learning and being. I couldn't have written this book without a lot of learning, could I? But there's a difference between being bound by our learning, so that every situation we go into is colored by our preconceptions, which is the way most of us come into adulthood. We've already have a lot of stuff loaded into that empty mind, and it's coloring our perceptions, right? So even things like our language, what it is to be a male or a female, what it is to be an American or somebody of a different nationality, what our race is, what our racism's a really good case of how to look at what the original mind that we're born with looks like, because nobody's born a racist, right? Everybody learns racism somewhere along the line. No child is. Children will react. They just take everything at the face value. So something may scare them, something unusual may scare them, certainly. But they don't have a preconception about what a certain kind of... They don't even have a preconception of what... they don't even know they're separate. Okay, which is what I'm returning to. We don't know we're separate. So one way to point... And what else don't they know yet? What are other things that we don't know yet? We know situational fear, but we haven't learned to fear. We don't have conditioned fear, And situational fear is something that I hope we don't give up. When somebody comes after us with a knife, it's a healthy response to be fearful and run, or whatever we have to do, right? But I don't know about you all, but I came into adulthood with a whole host of other fears. One of them was fear of presenting myself in public, which was huge. Which I was very, very shy and timid and scared as a young adult, and even into young adulthood. That was a learned thing that meditation helped me unlearn. That's a good example. I learned that it was scary to present myself because I might be harmed. And I later learned that fear was. Well, sure, you can be challenged, or somebody can insult you, or somebody can throw rotten vegetables at you or something. But in general, as an adult, it's not that threatening to have to present to people. So this leads me to a first self-experiment. I call these mindfulness of mind practices. That really comes out of Vipassana practice, that term. One of the things I start to do with students at the university, most of whom have not had exposure to Zen before. But I find that it's very helpful for people who have practiced for many years to have a new light or a new direction thrown upon practice. So there's the self that the original mind, you could say, didn't have a self. The original mind we were born with, we learned what it was to be a self, right? And everything that we think we are, male, female, our age, everything. When we're sitting in meditation, in that non-rational state, we don't know how old we are. If we're meditating successfully, I mean, we can just sit there looking like we're meditating, thinking, I'm 56 years old, my birthday's so, but that's not what we're aiming at, right? We're not thinking about how old we are. We're not thinking about we don't know what our jobs are, we don't know what our career is. We don't actually know anything, really, if we're sitting strongly, okay? Now, we all have to struggle sometimes. We're not always sitting like that, but in any moment of clarity or openness, that's the nature of that clarity of openness. We're in a mind that is not making those judgments or distinctions. It's not carving things up in that way. So one aspect of letting go of the self, of selflessness that we experience, if we look for it, and this lady's very right, we don't throw away rational thinking because it's very possible for a person to sit in very deep samadhi every time they sit down but have very little understanding, So there is some process of understanding, and the way that we use this process of understanding is I raise something that makes a question in your mind, right? So the next time you practice, you go into that and you carry that question and you say, well, is that really true? Is this mind really empty of everything? Does it really not know judgment? Is it really pre-rational? And you use that as an area as a pointer for investigation. Now, if the investigation works properly, the object of investigation or the rational part of it is left behind when you're in the depths of meditation. It may be picked up again when you come back out. That's very similar to the way we work with koans in Zen practice. And there may be a new light shown on it. Does that help make more sense about it?
Not really.
Yeah.
I have a point about that.
Okay.
Because, Ken Wilber, for instance, brought to consciousness this whole idea. He calls it the pre-trance fallacy. And to equate the pre-rational with the post-rational doesn't really make sense. Mm-hmm. The mind of the baby doesn't even have consciousness of himself. It's completely different brain. And yes, there is a similarity in the sense that we come at one. Mm-hmm. But it's such a different place to have consciousness that it has actually terrible consequences to kind of equate the two. And it's confusing, in my opinion. And I think Ken Wilber has written a lot about that, and I thought to me, it made a lot of sense.
There's all sorts of ideas and stories we can make about and ways of explaining these things. But I promise you, if you return to the non-thinking mind in meditation, you'll be meditating successfully. Now, we can argue about whether, of course, that's not the same mind we had when we were a baby.
I agree with that.
Yeah. I'm just pointing in a direction. I'm just saying we all knew that mind. We all knew that mind when we were infants, okay? It helps people to think, oh, wait, I already knew how to do this. I knew how to not think. Now, so our original mind was empty and we added all this stuff in, right? So you might say it's a mind of pure awareness, okay? And it looks very different, of course, from the view of a practice meditator than it does from a child who, as you say, doesn't know anything, has nothing to compare it to, is not thinking. Nonetheless, it helps people to reflect that space, we began with a spacious mind that had all these ideas loaded into it, right? In meditation, we return to the space around the ideas. We return to the awareness itself. We don't... the normal thinking mind is concerned with the objects of awareness. One way to characterize that mind that we began with, it was a mind that was purely aware. If you think about an infant mind, it sees everything and takes everything in, but it has no preconceptions about anything. And then it begins to learn. Probably first thing is that mom's separate, and which it needs to learn to survive. It begins to learn words, and it begins to learn concepts, and then and some of the concepts are what's going to happen tomorrow, so it learns about tomorrow. What's going to happen today? What happened yesterday might repeat itself tomorrow. It starts to think in terms of time. So these are all objects of awareness. What tends to happen by the time we become adults is the objects of awareness have become so primary that we no longer notice awareness itself. But awareness itself is there all the time. It's just like this room when it's empty. What makes the room useful is the space. What makes the mind useful is that we're aware. We load all these things into the mind, and then we start to come into the room, for instance. We notice all the useful things in it. We tend to lose track of the space, the spaciousness. Let's just try it for a minute. Just try it. This is a bit of a directive that my students have found very useful. So we choose a object of meditation such as the breath, right? One way to say what meditation is that we enter the mind of reality, that is to say, the mind that is in existence in the present moment. It's not the mind of past and future, which are concepts about reality. So if for the moment we allow ourselves to drop into the breath, to let go of notions of past, future, and even the present moment, because the present moment is defined by past and future. And then notice that we wouldn't know the breath was there if we weren't aware of it. Isn't that so? We have to be aware of the breath to know that we're breathing. So we begin in meditation by focusing, making our awareness one-pointed. Focusing on one object, the breath. Although the breath has its own magic, its own calming effect, the point isn't really to focus on the breath. The point is really to choose one point of focus that will allow us to let go of the other extraneous things that generally occupy our mind. So our minds become calmer and more spacious. It's really helped me to notice what it is when I'm thinking. I promise you that the thinking mind is not our business in meditation. So any ideas we have about meditation are useless when we're meditating, unless they point us to deeper meditation. We know we're thinking because there are words or pictures coming through our heads that we're caught up in. So when in the field of awareness that becomes apparent, we can use that as a little inspiration to let go of them, to return to the breath. Focus our awareness on the breath. We may notice that there's a certain sense of stillness available when we settle into that one-pointed awareness. It's okay to sink into that sense of stillness and spaciousness. So the breath's still coming and going, but we don't have to be so fastened upon it that we lose contact with our basic awareness. So I'd like us to notice, if it's possible, to touch that still space, or that space of silence, or that space of awareness in which the breath and thoughts and emotions seem to come and go and rise and fall. What is it like if we turn our attention to that field of awareness itself? If we just rest in that. So that's our primary dwelling place. Things come and go in the awareness. But awareness itself is more our business than any of the objects of awareness. So really notice what that feels like. We couldn't get through our daily lives if we weren't using awareness, but we tend to be so focused on the objects of awareness that we forget awareness. What's it like if we sink right into the awareness? Some interesting questions to ask about that is, how big does that field of awareness feel like it is? Where does it stop? Does it have any edges? What are the qualities of that field of awareness? Okay, so let me ask you a few questions about that. How many people could feel that sense of stillness for at least a moment or two? At least a few moments. Okay. So that's in shikantaza, or just sitting meditation, which is often what we practice in Zen meditation if we're not working on koans. We rest in pure awareness like that. Objects come and go, but resting in awareness is the main deal. That's what we're doing. Okay? So, what are some of the characteristics? I mostly asked about how big that was or where it stopped. Those are kind of trick questions. Some of you have heard me ask those same questions before. How big is it? Where does it stop? What are characteristics of it? How does it feel when you're inside that awareness? It doesn't stop, okay. It doesn't seem to stop anywhere, yeah, okay. What else?
I think it takes the shape and space and time of whatever it is that it's aware of, so that it's constantly shifting. It's like it takes the shape of whatever that's all.
Okay, that's good. And there is, when we first distinguish between awareness and the objects of awareness, that's simply to get us into that mind space. Ultimately, the objects of awareness are not separate from awareness. It's all one substance, you know. But it appears to be that way when we go there. It shifts and moves about. Okay, yeah. How about, I'm sorry, what's your name? Carol, can I just slightly pick on you a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
So everything that you bring to mind that is Carolness, in the context of that awareness, which is bigger?
Which is bigger?
Yeah. Which is bigger, Carolness? How did this It's this hard thing to talk about because we're talking about terms that awareness doesn't. Is awareness larger, or is Carolness?
The careless is not important.
Okay.
It just sort of comes and goes without. It's not important. The awareness doesn't attach itself to it.
Okay. So what I'm pointing to is that if we go back to the original mind that we were born with, there would have been a mind of awareness that we loaded Carolness into.
Right.
You know? So that is how we learned the self. That is how we learned what a self was. And a self is really useful. Believe me, I'm going to make sure that I've got mine in place as when I drive home to Taos tonight in case I get pulled over by a cop. I don't, you know, excuse me, who are you, sir? Can I see your driver's license? We are all one. It's not going to work, you know. I'm just large awareness. I can't remember where I put my license. No, it's, you know, I'm going to have to download that self, but it's not the main point. The self's a useful thing. Now, so what I'm pointing to is that we loaded the self into that awareness and then we forgot the awareness. That's the usual human condition. By the time we're adults, we're just lost in the self, and we forgot that there's an awareness that actually, if you look for it, is larger than the individual self. It's not separate from it, really. But do you get what I'm pointing to? Yeah, okay. So, so experiencing selflessness or experiencing original mind at some level can be as simple as that. And the reason I take such pains to point that out is I often find people, it's not uncommon for me to meet people. I met so many practitioners when I was doing this book. I interviewed more than 100 senior people and traveled all over the country and talked to many, many people. And it's not uncommon to find people who get so caught in a certain technique that they're not getting to the next level of their practice. It's very common. So it's not uncommon for people to start feel that big space of awareness and stillness and go, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be fastening on the breath. Okay, let that go and go back to the breath. The breath's supposed to lead you to that larger place. But some people are so nice and so obedient that they won't make that leap for themselves, so somebody's got to point it out for them, you know. So one of the reasons that I like to point to that big mind of big, you can call it a big mind of awareness. It's aware, isn't it? And doesn't seem to have any edges. That means, what is it? What's your name? Anya. So is the awareness that Anya experiences, did you feel that for a minute or two, at least, while we were just doing that? Isn't it funny how available it is? If you point yourself to it, it's pretty available. We can struggle and struggle sometimes to meditate, and believe me, I do it too, and not find that. And yet it's right there all the time. The awareness never goes anywhere. We wouldn't be able to function if we just are lost in what appears in it. The biggest part of it being, you know, our Carol or our Anya self, which seems to take over it. So if your sense of awareness seems limitless, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems something like that, aware, limitless, and my sense of awareness appears limitless, then, well, it's mine, you can't have it. No, I mean, whose is it? Whose is it then? It's the way it appears in meditation, at least, is that the awareness kind of runs from behind my eyes and ears and sense organs and out in some ineffable way up behind your ears and eyes and into your sense organs. So it's not really separate. You know, it's not really a separate awareness. Am I making sense? Can people relate to what I'm saying here? That when you're when you're in pure awareness, that large field of awareness, it's not mine. It's not mine. It's not so hard to practice that. If you remember it, if you remember to practice it. One way that I give to my students is that focus on awareness itself, not anything that appears in awareness. Now, was it Carol who brought it up that, of course, they're not ultimately separate? And sometimes somebody clicks on that. That's what insight's like. There is a cognitive aspect to it. Sometimes somebody comes back to me and goes, wait a minute, awareness isn't separate from the objects. And I go, bingo, okay, that's insight. That's good, you know. Nonetheless, it gives us a direction to head in. Okay, just head to awareness instead of all the stuff that appears to be in it. The other reason I like to point to it with my college students is they come from a variety of backgrounds, including Native American, Catholic, other Christian faiths. I had a person come a couple times to a meditation group that was Muslim recently. I get a lot of people who practice yoga and might consider themselves Hindus. Once you're in that field of awareness, how does that relate to what people's concept of God is in the theistic traditions? How does that relate to it? Is it a different thing? No, same thing, right? That large mind of awareness that we can connect, but we don't attach a self-concept to in Buddhist practice. We don't self it, we don't make it into a self. It's not any different from what people experience as God, if they're willing to get that close to what God is, you know, what they call God. Sometimes that makes people uneasy, because sometimes people are invested in, oh no, God's over there watching out for me over here. But I have also met a lot of people who, in the Catholic tradition, who are mystics and have practiced deeply, and we're all in agreement that we seem to touch some version of the same place, you know, in our practices. So that's one aspect of selflessness, that actually letting go of the self can seem like a really distant thing that, you know, can be really hard to get to, and it's kind of esoteric and it's hard to understand. It's not really so hard to understand. We were born with something approximating. We were born without a self-concept, let's put it that way, you know. And that was loaded in. And when we practice meditation, we're practicing beyond the self, if we're practicing strongly and well. At least that's where we're aiming. I'm not saying, you know, I don't want to make anybody feel bad about the practice if they're not feeling that every time they sit down. Everybody has ups and downs in practice, and it takes years. sometimes. But that's what we're aiming towards, is that one mind that is selfless, that was prior to the self, you could say, is prior to the self. We have all sorts of things to say about it because now we're adults and we have a thinking mind, right? but the awareness is the same. It's not personal. It was waiting there all along. It didn't know when we were 6 months old. It doesn't know when we're 56, which is what I am now. It doesn't know time in that way. There's another element of selflessness that I only have a few minutes to touch on, but I just want to touch on it, which is, so sometimes people fear that if they drop into that empty place, when they come back, they won't find that Anya again, you know. The funny thing is, we don't tend to think, oh, I'll come back and my body won't be here. You know, we always kind of know we'll come back to our body. Well, we'll come back to our, quote, self, this useful construct, in much the same way. However, the more that we enter this space where it drops away and we forget about it, it's like, it's as though we took off a suit of clothes, and when we come back, we put the self back on. It doesn't fit in quite the same way. You know, the more that we let go of the self, the less constraining it is. So one of the things that starts to happen is our functional self, what you might call the working ego. Although it doesn't go away, we need it. Like I say, if that cop pulls me over on the way to Taos, I'm going to have to raise that ego self and deal with it. But what I will hope is that certain elements of the ego self will have fallen away from practice. The elements of the ego self which are problematic, that can fall away, tend to be the defensive. Let me call it the inappropriately defensive elements of the ego self. So, and there's a series of exercises that I give my students around this. The first I give them is to notice, they just did that this week, they'll report tomorrow, to notice all week anytime they feel self-conscious or embarrassed, and notice how that makes them, how that colors their reaction. And also to notice what it is, because I'll just give you the shorthand. Embarrassment is a set of feelings in the body and probably the endocrine system. That's all it is, if we don't attach a story to it, right? So, the story is self-concept, right? This is how I overcame the embarrassment of being able to speak in front of groups. Oh, my face gets hot, my stomach churns, I feel a little weak in my knees maybe, you know. That's all it is. You know, unless my problem was I was attaching the story to it. You idiot, you idiot, you idiot. You know, some version of that, you know. Some version of you're not good enough story. The you're not good enough story is the second thing I ask students to look towards. We tend to all have an encoded, I call it the I suck voice. It's a voice, it's this voice of judgment that's always weighing us in against others. And oftentimes, at least in this culture, we find that it's usually finding us wanting, you know. So that's the second thing. When embarrassment functions, nothing is actually harmed in an adult. We tend to learn that embarrassed reaction and to shy away from situations that embarrass us because as children we needed to protect our developing egos. But as an adult, nothing is really harmed. If you really get that, okay, I'm going to step in, then you can start stepping into situations that embarrass you. And that's what I ask them to start doing. Because what's happening is that's an inappropriate defense that we no longer need for the ego self. It's really defending our self-concept, oftentimes a negative self-concept. We don't want our negative self-concept to come out, you know, so we're kind of defending it. Some other good ones that I use are taking offense. Taking offense is almost pure ego, you know. Now, that's not to say that I don't tend to do it sometimes if somebody speaks to me in a certain way. But that defensive response that comes up, it's not really needed, it's not helpful, it's not necessary. All it does is create separation, you know. So if we want to look for elements of the ego self, the functional ego self that we can let go of, and we can let go of some of them, we can look for areas where we're being defensive and ask ourselves if they're appropriate or if they're inappropriate. In many cases, if we're being psychologically defensive, it's not necessary. In many cases, I say that. I'm not saying in every case. But other ones is attachment to preferences or wanting things our way. Okay? That's an ego function that can fall away. So certain things that can fall away are some level of, or just like pure defensiveness, the kind of defensiveness we have in an argument with somebody where we're keeping a point just to keep the point. These are all good areas to look, because these, even though we still need an ego self, it's not going to be helpful when that cop pulls me over on the way back to Taos. I hope I'm not creating this. Actually, I had to race down here because I was coming from my dentist that I was a little late, so I guess this is on my mind. It's not going to help me to be defensive, is it? You know, it's not going to help me to go, oh, what are you doing, pulling me over, you know? So these are all things that we start applying mindfulness of mind to. Embarrassment, self-consciousness, defensiveness, taking offense, preferences, wanting things our way. So, you know, this is maybe material for another conversation because we're pretty much out of time. But there's an absolute way in which we let go of the self, which happens in meditation sometimes. When we sink into that awareness and a Carolness or Anya-ness or Sean-ness seems to disappear. It's good to understand that. The reason it can disappear is because we learned it in the first place. It's a very elaborate construct that we built up. We learned it in the first place. And in the functional self that we all walk around with, because we can't stay in that state of samadhi all the time, it's still possible to say, how am I defending this self? How am I defending it appropriately? Because there are appropriate defenses. And how am I defending it inappropriately? And I bet this is what I give to students, because very often if they can get rid of worry's another one. You're trying to control the future. You know, we're trying to control the future to defend this self. It's interesting to start to look at what the mind does, and a certain large percentage of it are those self-defensive actions that we don't really need as adults, and we can actually let go of as adults if we do this practice. And this is also how we carry a practice off the cushion into the world. You know, we've experienced that the self is in some way permeable, or in a certain way doesn't exist except as a set of ideas. You know, so how do I actualize that in the world? And so these are the ways we work on actualizing it in the world: is letting go of examining these things, these defensive postures of the self, and letting go of them. So it's time to stop. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. The opportunity to share the practice with you. It's a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you.